Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Ozirny. I am the head of youth services at the West Vancouver Memorial Library, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this virtual event with multidisciplinary artist Carey Newman, Hayalthkin'geme, the creator of the Witness Blanket. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am a settler here and that the West Vancouver Memorial Library has its home on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and in particular recognize the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I'm grateful that I get to make my home here and keep learning about how to do better and be better when it comes to sharing this place. I also want to let you know that we will be discussing things today that could be triggering or upsetting. And if you're watching on your own personal device, just take the time you need to step away, turn the volume down, or mute. And if you're watching with a class up on a big screen, just let your teacher or an adult in the room know if you need to take some time to step out. Self care is vital and courageous work, and we really support you in doing that. Before I introduce Carey Newman, Hayalthkin'geme, I'll tell you a little bit about our format. Carey will be presenting on his book, The Witness Blanket, Truth, Art, and Reconciliation, and we want to hear from you and take your questions. We will be asking Carey your questions at the end. You can email those in anytime during the event. The address is right down below. It is youth@westvanlibrary.ca. And thanks to librarian Lisa, who will be passing your questions on to me as they come. Also, a very special thank you to the West Vancouver Memorial Library Foundation for making this event possible. So without further ado, I'm excited to formally introduce and welcome Carey Newman, Hayalthkin'geme, to you. Carey is an artist, a carver, a filmmaker, an author, and a public speaker. He is also a teacher and community builder. Carey may be best known for the Witness Blanket, which is this incredibly moving, large scale piece that spans almost 40 feet long and contains 889 artifacts and objects from residential schools. We are so fortunate to have the touring replica of the Witness Blanket on display now at the library through March 10th, and even more fortunate to have Carey joining us today. Carey, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to visit this place we call West Vancouver.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Shannon. And thank you for hosting the Witness Blanket and for bringing me over here for this conversation, presentation, and also for the presentation that's going to happen later on this evening. Should I just jump right in? I'm not sure where we
Absolutely.
are
I'm going
with
to
tech, but
pass it over to you.
okay, I am going to share my screen. So that I can share a few visuals from a Witness Blanket. Just let me get this started. Shannon, can you tell me if you can see that, or can somebody indicate and make sure that that can be seen properly?
Yep, looks all good.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to start with the traditional introduction of myself, and it goes like this: Yo, Nuguam Carey Newman. Hayman Kwakwak'awakw Hayalthkin'geme. I come from the Kukwekum, Giiksam, and WaWalaby'ie clans of the Kwakwak'awakw Nation, which is on the northern end of what's currently known as Vancouver Island, as well as from the Stolotomach, which is along the upper Fraser Valley in its Coast Salish territory here on the Lower Mainland. That's through my dad. Through my mom, I'm English, Irish, Scottish settler from Saskatchewan. And the reason that I always introduce myself like that when I'm speaking to people is because I'm identifying all parts of my ancestry. And in doing so, I'm kind of calling them into this conversation a little bit. And in our traditional ways, making myself accountable to them for what I say. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the Witness Blanket, a little bit about a book that I wrote with a friend of mine named Christy Hudson about about the witness blanket. And this is actually, there's a picture of Kirsty for you to see, and there's me in the very, very early stages of starting to figure out how to build the blanket in the basement of my home. But to give you an idea of what the witness blanket is, it's, let's see, 10.5 foot tall by 40 foot long blanket, but it's made up of objects gathered from residential schools, churches, government buildings, and cultural structures across Canada. Um, and it was made to honor the lives of residential school survivors, the experiences of residential school survivors. And there's a picture of it there. I made this blanket back in 2000. I completed it in 2014. I started it in 2012. And it traveled around the country for about 4.5 years before I placed it into the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg. It's that partnership with the Museum for Human Rights that has brought this exhibition to the West Vancouver Memorial Library, and that this is one of 2 full-scale replicas of the blanket that travel around this country and others. So that's a little bit of the idea of the blanket. It's made up of these things that we gathered. So there's over 880 objects, as I think I said. And I'm going to just share this video. There's no sound to it today. But what you're looking at is actually a virtual reality version of the blanket that we've been building. So as I said, I finished the original blanket in 2014. It went on tour for 4.5 years. And since then, it's turned into the book that I'm going to introduce to you. It's turned into a documentary film that's available. It's led to the creation of what we call the Digital Witness Blanket, which is a website that has more stories beyond the ones that are in the book or in the documentary. And it's even led to the creation of what you're seeing now, which is this VR version of the blanket that we're hoping to release later this year. To make this, we had a team go to Winnipeg and 3D scan every single bit of the blanket, sometimes taking the pieces off to scan them, sometimes scanning them where they were. But we've then gone on to build this blanket build this VR blanket from the original, so that hopefully one day you'll be able to put on a headset and then walk around and see the blanket. So this is the book that I'm here to talk about. It's called The Witness Blanket: Truth, Art, and Reconciliation. And as you can see by the cover, it's written by me and my friend Kirsty Hudson. This is the second version of the book. The first version we did is a little bit bigger, maybe has a little bit more mature content. And our publisher really wanted us to write a version that was intended for a younger audience. And so that's the book that I'm here to talk about. And what we did was we adapted the original book to make it suitable for school age people. And I have a couple of readings that I would like to share with you from this book. And the first one is from the table of contents. It's from the chapter "Every Object Has a Story." And the reason that I want to share this is because it tells a little bit of the story behind a shoe that was found. And the shoe was one of the very first objects that we got when we were traveling the country, gathering the pieces for this blanket. So there's the shoe. I'm gonna start the reading now. When I started the process of collecting the pieces to make the witness blanket, I knew enough about residential school history to be prepared for how emotional the stories that came with them would be. I also knew I would need to be gentle with myself and the team, and that together we would need to be kind and caring with survivors and other people who participated. Sometimes just asking people to talk about what they've experienced can trigger emotions and re traumatize them. What I didn't anticipate or prepare myself for was the power that is held within the items themselves. I learned an important lesson early on when Rosie Hartman, one of the members of our team, brought me a piece that she had collected. It was a child's shoe from the site of a burned down residential school in the Yukon. The Carcross or Chutla Residential School sat in a valley on the shore of Nares Lake, a short distance from the village of Carcross, Yukon. Harold Gattensby went to school there, and as a boy, now he lives on the site where the residential school once stood. Harold doesn't have good memories of his experience at school. I knew three things at 12 years old. I was stupid, I was ugly, and I was going to hell, Harold said. Those three things I knew for sure. Everything else was mixed up and confusing. That's what residential school did to me. I don't ever want that any 12-year-old kid to be feeling like that. Harold wondered what people would say now if kids were taken away from their homes and families and put into a place where they didn't know anyone, where they didn't speak their language, and if they did, they got in trouble. Not for something that they did or didn't do, but just because of who they are. He thinks maybe then they'll understand what it was that they carry in their hearts. I'm going to go back to the shoot for 1 second because I wanted to read one little bit more. This is from a bit called Woven In. Having the shoe arrive early in the process taught me an important lesson. I had to respect the power of objects and stories and people equally. That experience changed my way of thinking. It changed the way I handled the items we collected, and it changed my creative process and the final work itself. From that point on, rather than seeing those items just as a bunch of random things that I was sticking onto this blanket, I recognized that each object was sacred. Another thing that there is a lot of on the witness blanket are photographs. When I first started to build it and ask for contributions, people would say, well, what if I have a photograph? And I would say, well, we would take that. But very often with photographs, people didn't want to give it away forever. They wanted it back. So what I did was we asked them to send it and we scanned the photograph, and then you can see how we went through this on this image here. We went through a process of transferring the photos to the surface of the wood that the blanket is made from. So there are more than 150 photographs on the witness blanket, and each of them tells a different story of a different time and different place. This particular photo came from a fellow named Tom Roberts, who is in residential school survivor. And here's a bit of the story that he sent along with it. In the 1920s, a boat called Bonita, which is Spanish for beautiful, traveled back and forth across Lac La Ronge in northern Saskatchewan. It ferried up to 40 Indigenous kids from one side of the lake to the other. Every September for decades, kids as young as 5 climbed into the boat and left their communities behind for another school year. They were all going to the same place, Lac La Ronge, or All Saints Residential School, on the south side of the lake. Tom Roberts said back then it would take some families a half a day just to make the journey to where the Bonita would pick them up. The route they took had 4 portages along the way. At every portage, the families would climb out of their boats, carry them overland to the next beach, and continue on the next leg of their journey. At the end of the last portage, they'd put their kids into this big boat to never see them again for 10 months, Tom said. How sad that journey must have been for parents when they went back home with no kids in their boat. It's like the Pied Piper took all the kids away from that one little village. The Bonita and many other boats like it would ferry kids back to their families the following spring when the school year was done. The boats carried kids and to and from the residential school on Lac La Ronge starting in 1907 and continued until the school burnt down in 1947. And the students at All Saints moved to a new school in Prince Albert, which is 124 miles or 200 kilometers away. Tom said his first day at All Saints was the saddest day of his life. He went there when he was 7 or 8 years old. Tom said he got very, very lonely. You don't know until you get there that your mom and dad aren't going to tuck you in at night, he said. One of Tom's lasting memories from All Saints was being told that because he was Indigenous, he couldn't do certain things. He said the staff at the school would say to him, "You're nothing but an Indian. You'll never be able to do it," Tom said. Tom said he and his friends would play games of cowboys and Indians, but nobody ever wanted to be the Indian. When Tom talks to young Indigenous students now, he always brings this black and white photo of kids packed onto the Bonita with him. The photo tells a story about one residential school in northern Saskatchewan, but it's just one of many hundreds of photos that were donated to the Witness Blanket. And like Tom's photo, each of them came with their own story to tell. Next bit that I would like to share with you is from Kids Will Be Kids. Sorry, I'm just finding the right page. Thought that I had marked all my pages, but apparently I forgot to mark one. Okay, I found it. Life at residential schools across the country followed a similar pattern. The days were typically made up of school chores and church. If there was time left over at the end of the day, that's when kids could sometimes just be kids, even if it was only for a little while. Many survivors shared stories of how sports, hockey, baseball, skiing, running helped them get through their time at residential school. Many of the objects we collected for the Witness Blanket tell part of that story. Children at the schools would sometimes have fun playing sports, creating art, making music, inventing imaginative games, or doing something else that allowed them to escape their harsh reality. One piece that stands out for me is the Gordon's Golden Hawks Ladies Hockey Tournament Championship Trophy. It came from Gordon's residential school in Puniki, Saskatchewan. The trophy is from 1996, the last year that that school was open, making it one of the newest objects on the Witness Blanket. There are 4 other photographs relating to hockey. 2 of them are formal team photos where the players line up in their uniforms, and one is from the Lejac Residential School in Fraser Lake. The other are from southern Alberta. Somewhere in a box of childhood keepsakes, I have a similar photo of me playing hockey as a boy. There's also a photo that shows a group of boys standing on the ice in their skates, holding their hockey sticks. Although they are all wearing newsboy caps instead of helmets, they look like they're getting ready for a game. The photo doesn't have a date in it, but you can see the Edmonton Industrial School in the background. There are even 2 old-fashioned hockey skates on the Witness Blanket. I mounted them in front of the pictures of the hockey teams. From the style of the skates, it looks like they're from the 1970s. I mentioned there are 4 photographs on a panel with the hockey skates. The reason I described only 3 of them is that I was saving my favorite for the last. It is a color photo peeking out from behind the lower 2 skates. It is of a group of boys in a field of slush and melting snow. They are all wearing gumboots and holding sticks and brooms and are covered in mud after what I imagine to be a spirited game of broomball. When I was making the witness blanket, I was often overwhelmed by the sad and tragic stories I heard. In those moments, I felt my mood darken. I would look at this picture, at those beaming smiles, and they were sunshine for my soul. Collectively, these stories are little pieces of humanity amid a lot of despair. I love how they illustrate the incredible resilience of human nature and remind me that kids will always find a way to be kids, even in the most difficult of circumstances. You see there on the bottom of the screen that the photo had that inscription on it. You were a hard bunch, but you sure knew how to have fun. Rather than doing a reading for this one, I'm going to talk a little bit about it. This braid is one of 2 braids on the witness blanket, and it comes from, both of them come from my sisters. One of the very few stories that me and my 2 sisters heard about our dad's time at residential school was the story from his first day there. When he entered the school, and one of the very first things that happened was they shaved his head. So when I set out to make the witness blanket and I was asking for contributions, my sisters thought that to honor that memory, they would grow their hair for the duration of the time that I was working on the blanket, and they would cut it off in ceremony when the time came for the blanket to be made. So the thing about this is something that happened to kids all across the country. It was part of the routine of residential schools. And the thing that maybe people don't think about when you think about going to get a haircut is if you get a haircut in a way that you don't want it, like you have your braid cut off or you have your head shaved clean, it can really affect the way that you think about yourself, or it can affect your identity. So in a lot of First Nation cultures, including my Kwakwak'awakw and my Coast Salish cultures, we cut our hair to show that we're sad. So it's like if someone who you love passes away, you might cut your hair as a sign of mourning. So we have a ceremony for that. And my sisters went through that ceremony where each day they went into at sunrise, they went into cold, clear water and dunked themselves 4 times. And they did that 4 days in a row. And then on the 5th day, they went through this process of having their hair cut from them in ceremony. And they gave that braid each of them gave their braid to me to put onto the blanket. And I think you can see by the look in their eyes how emotional it was for them to have their braids cut. And that was happening in a really loving and safe, cultural way. So whenever I look at those braids, I think about how difficult it must have been for all those kids across Canada who had their hair cut without their consent. The last bit that I want to share with you is called Reconciliation is a Journey. Back at the very beginning, when I was sitting in my living room with my feet on a small folding stool, the witness blanket was just an idea or a dream. If I were to speak my truth, I'd say that deep inside me, I thought that by making this blanket, I would be stitching together pieces of reconciliation itself. What I realize now is that back then, I didn't yet understand the meaning of reconciliation. The more I learned about the truth of what happened at residential schools, the intergenerational trauma that followed, and the historical and ongoing effects of colonialism, the better I understood the size and complexity of the issues that reconciliation must address. I now understand that truth must come before reconciliation, and that reconciliation is not limited to social repairs like providing clean water and equal access to healthcare and education. Those are basic human rights. Lasting reconciliation needs to be about disrupting the colonial systems that created these problems in the first place. It is about respect for this land, respect for each other, and recognizing all humans who live in Canada as equals. At first, that realization left me feeling overwhelmed, as though the problems were too big and too many to overcome. But then I started to think about how much I had learned about myself. That was when I began to understand that reconciliation is a journey rather than an act or a destination. Although I don't necessarily feel less conflicted about the experience of growing up, part Indigenous and part settler, by knowing the factors that led to that turmoil in the first place is a step toward reconciling all parts of who I am. When I started out making the witness blanket, I was doing it for my dad. Um, he is a residential school survivor, and you can see in the picture on the left, he's the one sitting on the train, and that picture is from the last Christmas that he spent at home before he was taken to residential school. The other picture there is of his mom and a few of his siblings when they were young. Um, and so the piece that I decided to put onto the witness blanket is this one. And you can see me there walking with my dad at the site of the residential school in Mission, British Columbia. That was the second residential school he went to. And he told us stories about being there. And so I went there and I cut that little branch, cut a piece from that little branch in the orchard. And I put it over top of that photograph with my sister's braids above and below. And so whenever I'm talking about the witness blanket and sharing stories about the witness blanket, I make sure to share this photograph because this is my dad. He is the inspiration for the witness blanket. His name is Victor. If you would like to know more about the witness blanket, to hear the words of some of the survivors, you can go to this website, www.witnessblanket.ca. You can click on the pieces to learn more about where they came from. There's a safe space for if you're feeling overwhelmed by the things that you're hearing. But each of these stories are about experiences of residential school survivors, and we enter them through the objects on the witness blanket. So there, for example, there's the mushroom bowl, which is about hunger. This one was from the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. And that is going to bring me to the conclusion of my presentation to you today. So I will finish by saying Gilakasla, which is thank you and also welcome in Kwakwak'awakw, and Haichkwasiya.
Carey, thank you so much for sharing that with us. If it's okay, we have some questions for you now. Anyone who's watching live, you can still email in your questions at youth@westvanlibrary.ca. That address is right below, and we probably have time to squeeze some in, even if you can get them in within the next few minutes. Carey, one of the biggest questions we're getting is how do you affix all of these different things to the blanket? Are you
Are you
using
using
glue
glue?
or nails or how are you actually putting this physically all together?
Well, that was one of the biggest kind of technical challenges of making the blanket because we were getting, like bricks and stones and um, pieces of roof and like we talked about hockey skates and braids of hair and photographs and documents. And so each of them involves a little bit of a different process. Some of them are mounted using custom made like wire mounts that kind of pinch and hold on to them. You ever see a plate on a wall where there's just these little things that come from behind it and then hold it in place? It's kind of like that, but we made them specifically for some of the objects. If it was something that we might not be able to drill through or glue, right? Um, some things are kind of sewn in place, like the braids are sewn down onto the wood using like a clear, almost like fishing line that's woven, that's sewn right underneath the hair so that you can't see it. For things like photographs, we actually figured out a process for taking them, printing them onto something called acetate, which is really just clear plastic. And we would print them the reverse of the way we wanted them, and then put clear acrylic down on the wood. And if you drop the piece on and roll it in perfectly and peel it up, the image stays. So we were transferring photographs and documents onto the witness blanket using this method. Um, so I guess the answer is a lot of different ways were used to mount things and hold things together. But the structure itself, that's made from Western red cedar, that are pinched together over top of stainless steel cable. And the reason that I really wanted to do it that way instead of building it like a wall is because I wanted the blanket to represent something that you would wrap around yourself. And if it were a wall, then a wall is an obstacle, right? It's something that keeps people apart. A blanket is something that we use for comfort, for healing, for warmth. And so it was important to me in building the blanket to make sure that even though it was being made out of these solid objects, that I was making it, I was still kind of weaving it together the way you weave together fabric.
Yeah. A bit of a follow-up to that is, did you get a lot of blisters?
um, I would say yes, because but I might just give a little bit of um, a nod of a tip of my hat to Teus, who was and still is my studio assistant, and he was the person who was sanding all those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of blocks of wood, and so I got like a few blisters, but Teus jokes that he lost his all his fingerprints when he was sanding because he had to sand literally hundreds of blocks of wood. And I told him each day, like I had patterns for them, that he had 1 millimeter of tolerance up or down.
Well, now he can lead a life of mystery without fingerprints and get away with a lot of things. One question that I have for you, I'll just go back and forth on the question list here is, I was telling you about how beautiful the witness blanket site is, and you mentioned the safe space on the site that helps give people a kind of a break from the content or a chance to recenter themselves. How did you and how do you look after your mental health when it comes to both engaging with this piece still and also during the creation process? How do you look after yourself?
Um, a few different ways. One, I think the main way was, especially during the time when we were working on the blanket, was for our team to come together um, to do cultural ceremony. So we had an elder who was part of the project, and she would come and she would do a brush off with which is what you have your body and your spirit. Um, brushed down with cedar boughs. And she would also sometimes do a smudge where she burns cedar and tobacco and sage together, and and we would use that for cleansing. We did that for the pieces that we brought in and also for ourselves. But I think that what I try to continue to do is to talk about it. And when I'm talking about it, I very often get emotional, and I always think of the kind of negative way that some people think about people who show emotion publicly. And so very often when I'm talking about the blanket in public, I'll get a little tear in my eye. I'll feel emotional. And people will come up after and say, "Oh, it's okay." And I always answer them by saying, "Yes, I agree. It is okay." Because um, I think that the one of the big harms can be is if you try to hold it in and try to act strong. And so instead of holding it in, I have a practice of making sure that when emotions come, I I let them out instead of trying to hide
Um, on that note, did you ever expect that the blanket would have this wide of a reach? Like, did you ever imagine that? I mean, this 10 years later and it'll be decades later and long after you're gone that this blanket will continue to affect people. When you were actually in the throes of making it, were you prepared for this kind of reception?
it. No. Um, the furthest ahead I planned was trying to think of somewhere that might, like one place that we might be able to give it to install it. Like, where are we going to display it? That was at the beginning of the project, and when we were making the blanket, that was still a question because we weren't working with the Museum for Human Rights yet. We kind of thought that it should go in a big public institution, and it was actually during the process of making it that the opportunity came up for a tour, and the idea for the tour came from people everywhere where we were gathering these objects. They'd say, "Where can we see it?" And I kind of started to get this idea of bringing the blanket back to all of the places that it came from. And then when the funder for the blanket called and said, "Hey, there's a little bit of extra money available. Do you have a use for it?" I said, "We need to have a tour." And we used the money to build crates and to build the stands that held up the original blanket. And it turned into the tour. So I didn't even plan far enough forward when I was making it to think of the tour. When you were asking the question, I looked down at the corner of my computer screen and I saw that it's 2024 and that we completed this for the first time in 2014. So that's a full 10 years. This is its 10th year anniversary. Its 10th year, its 10th birthday is 2 months from now. So so no, I don't think that there's any way that any artist can imagine having two big replicas that are traveling, being able to have conversations with you and everybody who's tuned into this call, um, to have a movie and books and the opportunity to make a VR project. It's I think it's a testament to art, to the power that art has to kind of call people into conversations or invite them into conversations in different ways that allow for us to express our own imaginations. So I didn't anticipate it, but I'm trying to make sure that I honor the responsibility that I took on when I went out and started asking for people to make contributions to this blanket.
I'm so excited to hear about the VR installation because I think it will be at the library. We have the replica on display till March 10th, and I think it will be hard for us when it leaves, but now we could buy our own VR headset and maybe later this year have it permanently here in a spot in our library for people to access. We have some questions about how you became an artist, and you write in your book about the impact of your dad, but we have a lot of young people watching who are wondering what your path was.
I think I kind of was born with a pencil in my hand. Um, my dad is an artist. Um, the the year I was born, he was at um, a place called Kisan, and when he was younger, he was a fisherman and he was a logger. But he got an injury that meant that he couldn't run around in the woods or run around on a fish boat anymore. And so the year I was born, he was in Kisan learning to carve. Now, carving has been part of my family ancestry for at least 5 generations. So I have some of the totems that are in Stanley Park are carved by my great aunt and my great great grandfather. We have a long, long family history of being artists and carvers. So I grew up seeing my dad carve in his studio and taking little bits and pieces of the things that he made and making cars. That's how I started out. Actually, I would take the bits of wood left from my dad's carving and the spools of thread I would steal from my mom's sewing machine and turn them into wheels. And I somewhere I still have a little wooden car that I made when I was about 5 years old. I also, you probably can't see, but I have a
Oh, yeah.
scar on my thumb that I got when I was 5 years old. That was the first time I tried to carve. So I just always did it. And I was really fortunate to have parents who valued art and saw that it was, that you can actually do that for a living instead of trying to make me become a professional of some sort. And so I just stuck with it, and and uh, and it's led me to so many different places that I would never have dreamed art would take me.
Also, an interesting question here. Do you ever get tired of talking about the witness blanket?
No, it took me a second to think about it because there are certain times of the year, like the lead up to September 30th, Orange Shirt Day, that I get a little worn down the um, from being out there and talking. But it's not that I'm tired of talking about the witness blanket. Um, it's the number of times. It's when I have to do it a whole bunch of times in close succession. So I think that it wouldn't really matter what I was talking about. I would get a little bit tired. Um, but I do once in a while. Um, I do try to share space so that I'm not always the only person talking about it. So we still have members of the original Witness Blanket team who do talks like this sometimes. If we're having screenings of the documentary and I can't go, sometimes another member of the team will go. Um, and we also try to encourage people to make space for having survivors or intergenerational survivors come and tell their stories so that so that I'm not centered in the story. Um, but no, I don't. And I think that if I ever did get tired of it, in the same way I've made a promise to myself that if it ever stops feeling like if I ever stop getting feelings from talking about it, like the emotional ones,
Mm,
then I'll take a little break.
yeah. One question I had for you, and I think we have time for a few more, is how teaching kind of feeds you now. You teach at the University of Victoria. How does that kind of play into your life as an artist, or Um, how is that contributing to your life now?
Well, speaking of like, how did you get where you are? I'm pretty sure that if I hadn't have made the witness blanket, I wouldn't be a professor at a university. Um, the the art literally led me to this part of my life where I do get to teach. And I wasn't sure when because I've been doing it for 5 years, and I wasn't sure when I started how it would feel. But I really, really love it because I get to sit and talk with students who have all these incredible ideas and help them figure out how to make things that they want to make and how to say things that they want to say. So I kind of specialize in public art and art that has kind of a social purpose, the way that the witness blanket does. Um, which means I get to hear about the things that other people are going through, the things that other people think are important. Um, and it's really invigorating. I have class, I get to talk with my students, to share my work and the work of others, and then we talk about their work. And that's where I get nourished by the process of teaching.
I think we have time for a couple more questions here. Um, let's see, where should we go? Uh, this is an interesting one, especially for this audience. Did you enjoy school growing up, or what was your relationship like with school?
So interesting. For someone who's speaking to maybe a bunch of people in schools right now, and for someone who teaches in a university, I was homeschooled.
Hmm.
Um, my mom was a school teacher, and she decided um, that she wanted to homeschool me and my sisters. At that time, there was quite a bit of uh, there was just lower expectations for Indigenous kids, and she thought that if we were in school, then we might not believe we could achieve everything we could achieve. I mean, if you think back to some of the things that were said by some of the survivors in the reading that I shared about being made to feel like they weren't good enough, that was what my mom was afraid of. And so she came up with the idea of homeschooling me and my sisters. And having been a residential school student, my dad was fully on board. So I did go to grade school for 1 year in grade three. And I went because I have two sisters. One is 3 years older, and the other is 5 years younger. And I was always, I'm very competitive with my siblings. And I was always comparing myself to my sister, who was 3 years older. So when you're in grade three, you're what, 9 years old? She was 12 and she was faster and smarter. And so my mom put me in school for a year so I could see how I compared to other kids. So I did have a little bit of time in school, and I kind of enjoyed it, but I was also very happy to go back to homeschooling in grade four. So my experience with schooling was quite different, I think, than a lot of people's experiences.
This is another really interesting question is, do you have any advice for young creators who want to tell hard stories?
That's a really, really good question.
And I think they mean here like emotionally hard stories or
Yeah.
stories they might find it hard to tell.
Yeah. I think one of the important things is something that I mentioned when I was talking about emotion, that you can only take on what your heart has room to carry. So, but also I want to say again that feeling and showing emotions, we need to normalize that in this world. We need, instead of believing that tears or emotions are weakness, we have to start thinking of those tears and emotion as strength. because it's very, very cathartic, or like it's really helpful when you let them out. So maybe some of my advice would be around how you prepare yourself for telling those difficult or hard stories. Um, and and I hope that by saying out loud to all of these people here that if you're taking on difficult stories and sharing them, and you feel emotional about it, that those emotions are natural and normal and healthy, but that you do have to take care for yourself. You do have to make sure you have somebody or some people that you can turn to, because sometimes you really just need to be able to talk it through. But I think that the world needs brave people. So I really encourage anybody who's thinking about sharing things that are difficult to share, to find somebody who you can talk with who will be supportive of that, so that you can.
Yeah. And I think the last question, this is one I always like to ask any creator or artist who has kids. Do you feel comfortable sharing how your child inspires you, either in your life or your work or both?
I thought maybe I was going to get through this presentation without feeling emotional, and then you asked me that. So I said that I made this blanket for my father. But another thing that I often, and I did, but another thing that I often say is I also made it for my daughter. She's 13 years old. She loves competitive jump rope. She's a public speaker. If you look up the TEDx talk that I did at Whistler last year, she introduced me, and she wrote her own speech, and so she's inspiring just on her own, like to other people around her. But the reason I say that I made it for her, because she was just a tiny baby when I found out that I was gonna have this opportunity, this privilege of making the witness blanket, and because the way that we disrupt traumatic cycles, the way we stop sharing the worst parts of the experiences of uh, of of being Indigenous in Canada, is to take control of the narrative and to make sure that she doesn't have to, and all those other kids and future generations don't have to experience the same things that I experienced, or and I can already see that my life has been a whole lot different from my dad's. Just the conversation about whether or not, about my experience of school. I was homeschooled with loving parents. I could build a tree fort and play soccer whenever I wanted. My dad was in residential school. That's a pretty huge difference. Now, um, so I was, right from when she was a tiny baby, I was inspired by wanting to make sure that these stories were preserved so that when the time was right, she could know, um, so that she could draw strength from the same things that survivors draw strength from. Um, so that's one way that she inspires, but kids in general have such beautiful and irrepressible energy, that I get inspired by all kinds of people. Even looking on the witness blanket, there's something called Project of Heart tiles, and it was a project that was also funded by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and kids would color these little wooden tiles, and they were making canoes and covering different things with them, and they sent some to the witness blanket as a contribution. And the positivity that I get from when I talk with kids about the witness blanket, about residential schools, and the way that young people can see the kind of fundamental unfairness of it, that gives me so much hope for the process or the journey of reconciliation, because I start to think about what this world will be like when the kids who are maybe listening into this conversation right now and have grown up understanding the relationship between Indigenous people in Canada and all of the difficulties that have occurred over 150 plus years, when they're making the decisions of the future, I think that's when we get close to the actualization of reconciliation. Um, so I know that's a lot to put on one little girl, but maybe I'll extend it out and share that that inspiration comes from young people all over the place. So yeah, that's uh, how she and many other children inspire me.
Thank you for that. We are sadly at the end of our time together, Carrie. I'm so grateful that we got a chance to talk today. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your emotions and sharing your art with us here at the West End Memorial Library.
Thank you, Shannon, for having me, and thanks everybody for tuning in. If you have any questions that you didn't get answered, please email them to Shannon and she can forward them to me.
Absolutely. I just want to wrap up by saying a big thank you again to our West Vancouver Memorial Library Foundation for making this event happen. And a huge thank you to all of you for watching, especially the teachers and teacher librarians who got this live stream up on the smartboard or gave your students time to watch it. Finally, if you have not been yet to see the witness blanket replica at the library, please come. You have until March 10th. Come by anytime we're open, 7 days a week. You will see the witness blanket as soon as you walk in our main hall. You can't miss it. Thanks again for joining us and have a wonderful rest of your day.